On August 20th, 1966, two electronics technicians walked onto a hillside outside Niterói, Brazil. They never walked back. Their bodies were found wearing waterproof coats and crude lead eye masks, with a cryptic note nearby telling whoever discovered them to swallow a capsule after the effect and protect metal plates from some kind of signal. There was no autopsy, no toxicology report, no investigation that ever produced an answer. Whatever happened on that hill remains unexplained, and that is where the real mystery begins. Because the Niterói case is not an isolated tragedy. It belongs to a much stranger collection of cases in which the evidence is undeniable, but the meaning behind it has disappeared. Objects remain, but their instructions make no sense. Bodies are arranged as if someone intended a message. Records end precisely where the answers should begin. Across centuries and continents, 10 cases like these have survived, and everyone leaves the same unsettling question behind. What happened when the evidence stopped speaking? Our first case takes us back to that hillside in Niterói. The hill sits above Niterói like something the city agreed to stop looking at. Locals call it Morro do Vintém, Vintém Hill, a modest green rise across the bay from Rio de Janeiro, the kind of place that, on any ordinary Saturday, draws hikers who want a view of Guanabara Bay without the crowds of Sugarloaf. It is not remote, it is not hidden, and that, in the end, is part of what makes what happened there in August 1966 so difficult to file away. On the afternoon of August 20th, a group of children flying kites on the hillside noticed something strange in the underbrush. Two men, lying on their backs, side by side, dressed for weather that didn't match the season. It was winter in Brazil, mild and dry, but the men were wearing heavy waterproof raincoats. Over their eyes, each wore a crude mask made of lead, the kind of material you'd expect on someone standing in front of an X-ray machine, not lying in the grass on a public hillside in the middle of the day. The police were called. What they found, once they moved past the shock of the masks themselves, only deepened the strangeness. The two men were identified as Manuel Pereira da Cruz, 34, and Miguel José Viana, 32. Both worked as electronics technicians in Campos dos Goitacazes, a city several hours away, repairing radios and televisions for a living. Ordinary men, by all accounts, with wives, children, steady jobs, no criminal history, no known enemies. Neither had a documented history of mental illness. Neither, as far as investigators could establish, had any reason to be found dead together on a hillside they had traveled hours to reach. There were no visible wounds. No signs of a struggle, no indication of violence at all. Their bodies were arranged with an almost deliberate neatness, laid out parallel to each other, arms at their sides, as though they had chosen the position themselves and simply waited. Beside them, investigators found a scattering of objects that read less like evidence and more like the fragments of a ritual whose rules no one wrote down. A small bottle of water, two towels, still folded, and a notebook page, torn out, bearing a short cryptic set of instructions in Portuguese. The exact wording has been translated slightly differently across the decades, but the substance of it has remained consistent. Something about being at a determined spot, at a determined time, instructions to don the metal masks, and a final note to swallow a capsule after some kind of signal, described only as the effect, and if breathing became difficult, to make a specific hand signal. No capsules were ever found on or near the bodies. No signal, radio, visual, or otherwise, was ever identified. And no one has ever established with certainty what the effect was supposed to be. This is where the case should have resolved itself, the way most sudden deaths do, into a single unglamorous explanation. It never quite did. The initial autopsy offered little clarity. Investigators found no obvious trauma, no gunshot or stab wounds, nothing to suggest an attack. Pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs, was noted, which can result from a wide range of causes, from poisoning to certain kinds of asphyxiation to entirely natural causes. But 1966 forensic science, especially in a regional Brazilian police department without access to advanced toxicology labs, was not equipped to answer the deeper question. What, specifically, had caused it. By the time more sophisticated tests might have been possible, the bodies had already been buried, and Brazilian law at the time made exhumation and further investigation difficult to pursue. The case was effectively closed within weeks, filed as a death by undetermined causes, and the men were laid to rest without ever being definitively explained. For a case with no confirmed foul play, no confessed motive, and no criminal charges, it is remarkable how persistently it has refused to disappear. The most immediate, mainstream explanation offered at the time, and still favored by many researchers today, centers on the men's own hobby. De Cruz and Viana were said to have a shared interest in the paranormal, mysticism, and possibly amateur experiments involving radio communication with the beyond, a pursuit that had some cultural traction in Brazil in the mid-1960s. Under this theory, the two men designed their own bizarre ritual, perhaps believing the lead masks would protect them from some anticipated cosmic or electromagnetic effect, and the capsules, whatever they contained, were self-administered as part of a suicide pact gone tragically, almost theatrically, wrong. It's a theory that fits the physical evidence reasonably well. The deliberate arrangement of the bodies, the prepared instructions, the absence of any sign that someone else had been present. But it leaves gaps that are hard to close. If this was a planned death, why the towels, still folded, as though laid out for later use rather than as part of a final ritual? Why no trace of the capsules, not fragments, not residue, not even in the men's stomach contents? And why would two technicians, apparently sound of mind and with no prior indication of suicidal ideation, choose a public hillside in daylight rather than somewhere private for an act meant to be final? A second, more grounded theory shifts the focus away from ritual and toward the men's day job. Some investigators have pointed to the possibility that De Cruz and Viana had, in the course of their work, been exposed to a toxic substance, perhaps in connection with unauthorized repair work or contact with a hazardous chemical they didn't fully understand the danger of. Under this reading, the lead masks weren't part of a mystical protective rite at all, but a genuine, if misguided, attempt to shield themselves from something they believed, correctly or not, posed a real physical danger. The capsules in this version might have been intended as an antidote or protective measure, self-administered too late, or not at all, before the exposure overcame them. It is a theory that requires no supernatural leap, only human error and fear. It has never been proven. It has also never been ruled out. And then there are the theories that move further from the ground. Within a year of the deaths, some Brazilian newspapers and researchers began connecting the case to the broader wave of UFO reports moving through South America in the 1960s, suggesting that De Cruz and Viana might have gone to the Hill expecting to witness, or even participate in, some kind of extraterrestrial contact event, one they believed the lead masks would protect them from. It's worth noting that this theory has never rested on anything beyond circumstantial suggestion. No witnesses reported unusual aerial activity over Vintém Hill that day, and no physical evidence at the scene points to anything beyond what a careful, deliberate human hand could have arranged. But the case's peculiar details, the specificity of the note, the reference to an effect, the deliberate shielding of the eyes, have made it a durable fixture in UFO research circles for decades, cited alongside far better-known cases as one of the strangest unresolved files in the field. Still others have speculated about something closer to espionage, that the men had, knowingly or not, become entangled with a group testing some kind of chemical or psychological agent, and that the ritual elements were staged, or at least directed, by someone else who was never identified. This theory tends to lean on the era itself. The mid-1960s were not a stable time in Brazil, politically or otherwise, and clandestine testing of various kinds was not unheard of globally during the Cold War. But there is no direct evidence, no witness, no document, no confession that connects Vintém Hill to any such program. It remains, like the others, a shape drawn around an absence. What's left, nearly 60 years later, is a case that resists every explanation offered for it without fully collapsing under any of them. The suicide theory fits some details, and not others. The toxic exposure theory is plausible, but unverified. The stranger theories persist not because the evidence particularly supports them, but because nothing else has managed to close the gap they fill. Two men climbed a hill in broad daylight. They put on masks meant to block something, whether real or imagined. They laid out towels they never used and waited for an effect that no one, not their families, not the police, not 60 years of researchers, has ever been able to name. What was it they thought they were protecting themselves from? And whatever it was, did it work? There is a particular kind of silence that follows a question no one can answer. And in the story of Vintém Hill, that silence settled around a single word scrawled on a torn notebook page. The effect. No one ever learned what it meant. No one ever will. But that same shape, an ordinary detail transformed into something unresolvable, a fragment of language that points toward an explanation it never delivers, appears again 9 years later and 2 continents away, on a stretch of West German highway where a truck driver vanished mid-journey and left behind, eventually, a single photograph almost no one can agree is real. The road is the Bundesautobahn 73, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the wooded hills of northern Bavaria, connecting the town of Suhl in the east to Bamberg in the south. In the summer of 1975, it was a working road, used by freight haulers moving goods between towns whose names most outsiders would never learn, past forests thick enough to swallow sound, through a landscape of small, tidy villages that had spent the post-war decades rebuilding themselves into quiet irrelevance. It is not the kind of place where history usually happens. It is exactly the kind of place where, according to the story that has circulated for decades since, history happened anyway, and then erased its own tracks. The man at the center of it was named Günther Stoll, a truck driver by trade, said to be in his mid-30s, employed to haul freight along the routes connecting Bavaria's smaller industrial towns. On the morning of August 5, 1975, Stoll was reportedly behind the wheel of his truck on the A73, somewhere between Suhl and Ludwigstadt, making a delivery run he had likely made dozens of times before. And then, according to the account that has been retold across German forums, late-night radio segments, and eventually a wider English-speaking internet, he simply wasn't. The truck, the story goes, was found still idling by the roadside. Engine running, cargo undisturbed, cab empty. No skid marks, no sign of a struggle or a swerve, no indication that Stoll had pulled over for any reason other than choice, and no indication of what that reason might have been. His personal belongings, including his wallet, were said to still be inside. A search was mounted. Nothing was found. Not that day, not in the weeks after, not ever. Günther Stoll, if he existed exactly as described, walked away from a running truck on a rural highway and was never seen again. This much of the story, the vanishing, the idling truck, the absence of evidence, is where most retellings agree, more or less. It is also, and this needs to be said plainly, the point at which the paper trail becomes very thin. Unlike Vintém Hill, which produced an official police file, named investigators, and a documented autopsy, the Stoll case exists almost entirely within second-hand retellings, oral tradition passed between German mystery enthusiasts, and internet forums that trace back, as best anyone has been able to determine, no further than the early 2000s. No contemporary 1975 newspaper report has been definitively located. No original missing persons file has surfaced. This absence is, in its own way, as central to the mystery as anything that supposedly happened on the A73, because it means the story of Günther Stoll's disappearance rests almost entirely on what came next, rather than on the disappearance itself. What came next is a photograph. The story holds that sometime in the early 1990s, following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the gradual opening of previously sealed Eastern Bloc archives and institutions, a photograph surfaced from within Russia, reportedly from the records of a psychiatric hospital, or in some versions a labor camp deep in Soviet territory. The image, grainy and unremarkable at first glance, showed a man standing against a bare wall, holding a small handwritten sign, the kind used in institutional intake photographs the world over. A face, a date, a designation. The man in the photograph, those who have circulated the image insist, was Günther Stoll. Not a resemblance, not a family likeness. The same face, aged by roughly the number of years that had passed since 1975, down to details some retellings claim were specific enough to rule out coincidence. A particular scar, a particular asymmetry in the brow. And on the sign he held, instead of a name or a date that made immediate sense, was a string of characters that has never been fully or consistently deciphered, rendered in most versions as YOGTZE, though other tellings offer slight variations. A scramble of letters that resembles no standard Cyrillic transliteration, no known code, no acronym anyone has been able to trace to a real Soviet institution, department, or classification system. If the photograph exists, and this is a genuine if, one that researchers who have tried to trace the image's origin have never been able to resolve, it raises questions that are, by design or by accident, almost impossible to answer. Where did this photograph come from, if no verified source, archive, or publication of origin has ever been produced? What does YOGTZE mean, if it means anything at all? And if this was Günther Stoll, missing from a Bavarian highway in 1975, how did he come to be photographed inside a Soviet institution during the Cold War? A period in which the border between West Germany and the Eastern Bloc was, by any conventional account, among the most heavily monitored and least permeable in the world? The most straightforward explanation, and the one favored by most researchers who have looked closely at the case, is unglamorous but hard to dismiss. That the entire story, in its modern form, is a piece of internet-era folklore, a compelling urban legend built from a real or invented missing persons rumor, later fused with a photograph of uncertain or fabricated origin, and refined over years of retelling into something that reads like documented history without ever having been one. Under this reading, no primary 1975 source has been found because none exists in the form the story describes. The photograph cannot be traced because it was never a genuine Soviet institutional record, but rather an image repurposed, misattributed, or manufactured to fit a narrative already taking shape in mystery forms. This explanation accounts for the case's most persistent feature, its total absence from any contemporaneous documentation, better than any alternative. It also notably does not require anything supernatural, geopolitical, or scientifically extraordinary to be true. It only requires that a good story, told often enough, eventually stops sounding like one. And yet the explanation has never fully closed the case, for a reason that has less to do with evidence and more to do with persistence. Decades on, researchers in Germany interested in unexplained disappearances continue to search for the original source of the photograph, continue to comb regional archives for any 1975 missing persons report that might correspond, however loosely, to a truck driver vanishing along the A73. Some have proposed that if a real disappearance did occur, it may have been recorded locally, in a small-town police log never digitized, its details drifting into legend precisely because no formal national investigation was ever mounted for what may have looked, at the time, like an ordinary case of a man walking away from his own life. Beyond the search for a mundane origin, the case has also accumulated its share of theories that reach further. Cold War intelligence speculation is perhaps the most enduring. That Stoll, whether willingly or not, was drawn into an intelligence operation, an East German or Soviet extraction of a West German citizen for reasons never disclosed, with the psychiatric setting in the photograph explained as a cover or as the genuine grim endpoint of a defector or informant who had outlived his usefulness. This theory accounts for the total lack of a paper trail by assuming, essentially, that one was deliberately erased, a proposition that cannot be proven, but also cannot be entirely dismissed, given how thoroughly Cold War intelligence services on both sides of the border are now known to have manipulated identity, movement, and institutional record-keeping when it served their interests. Further out still are the readings that treat the case as something closer to a genuine anomaly of time or identity. A man who did not so much disappear as slip out of the continuity that connects one place to another, resurfacing years later and a continent away with no memory of the years between, or no ability to explain them. These theories owe more to speculative fiction than to any documented precedent, and it would be dishonest to present them as anything but a lens some choose to apply when a case resists every ordinary explanation offered for it. But their persistence says something about the shape of the mystery itself, that a story this incomplete leaves room for almost anything to be poured into it, and that the less verifiable a case becomes, the more it seems to invite exactly the kind of unverifiable answer nothing can ever rule out. What remains, when the folklore is set beside the near-total absence of primary documentation, is a case built almost entirely out of its own gaps. No confirmed 1975 report. No traceable photograph. No institutional record in Russia, East Germany, or anywhere else has ever been produced to corroborate the story independently of the story itself. And yet the name persists. Günther Stoll, a man who may have existed exactly as described, who may have been an amalgam of several unrelated disappearances, or who may, in the strictest sense, never have existed at all outside the version of him that decades of retelling have slowly built. If there was a photograph, if somewhere in an archive that has never been opened to outside researchers, an image really does show a Bavarian truck driver's face staring out from behind Soviet institutional walls, what would that sign have been trying to say? And if there wasn't, if the entire trail leads back only to the story that invented it? What does it mean that so many people, across so many years, wanted so badly for it to be true? From the sealed archives of the Eastern Bloc, the story now pulls back across an ocean and a quarter-century further into the past, to a place where the silence isn't bureaucratic, but oceanic. A scrap of rock in the North Atlantic so small and so remote that for most of its existence, no one thought to give it more than a passing name. Eilean Moor is the largest of the Flannan Isles, which is a modest distinction, because largest here means barely 39 acres of grass-covered stone rising out of the sea some 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis in Scotland's Outer Hebrides. Sailors had known the islands for centuries. Shepherds occasionally ferried sheep out to graze on the thin turf, and local fishermen gave the isles a wide, respectful berth, treating them as sacred ground tied to an old chapel dedicated to St. Flannan, whose ruins still sit near the island's summit. But it wasn't until the final years of the 19th century that Eilean Moor acquired the structure that would make it famous for a reason no one could have predicted. A lighthouse, perched on the island's highest point, 330 feet above a sea that, on a bad day, could turn the entire island into something closer to a wave than a piece of land. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse was completed in December 1899, built by David and Charles Stevenson, part of the same family of engineers responsible for much of Scotland's great chain of coastal lights, specifically because the waters around the islands had claimed enough ships to make the isolation worth the cost. It was, by design, one of the most remote manned lighthouses in Britain, staffed on a rotation of 3 keepers at a time, with a 4th stationed on shore to relieve them in turn. Supplies and mail arrived only when the sea allowed, sometimes with weeks between visits. It was solitary work, but not unusual work. Lighthouse keeping across the British Isles at the turn of the century was a life built entirely around this kind of isolation, and the men who took it on understood, better than most, what they were signing up for. On the night of December 15, 1900, the steamer Archer passed near the Flannan Isles during a voyage from Philadelphia to Leith, and its crew noted something that, at the time, seemed worth only a passing mention in the ship's log. The lighthouse was dark. No beams swept the water. In an era before radio communication with remote stations was standard, this alone wasn't cause for immediate alarm. Lights could fail, be obscured by weather, or go unlit for any number of mundane reasons, and the Archer's report wasn't relayed to the mainland until the ship reached port days later. It was not until December 26th, 11 days later, that a relief boat, the Hesperus, finally managed to reach Eilean Moor, delayed by the same rough Atlantic weather that made the island's isolation so complete in winter. What the relief crew found, as they approached, was wrong in a way that took a moment to name. No flag had been raised to greet them, as was customary. No supply boxes waited on the landing stage for the return trip, and as the ship's boat drew close enough to see the base of the cliff, no one came out to meet them at all. The relief keeper who went ashore, Joseph Moore, later gave an account of the scene that has become the foundation for everything written about the case since. The entrance gate to the lighthouse compound was closed. The main door was shut, though unlocked. Inside, the beds were unmade, one of them apparently made in haste rather than left as it would be during the day. A chair was overturned in the kitchen, knocked over, or so it seemed, rather than simply left out of place. And on the table, according to Moore's account, sat the remains of a meal, though descriptions of exactly what, and how disturbed the scene actually was, have varied and, in some later retellings, been considerably embellished beyond what his original report describes. The three keepers, James Ducat, the principal keeper, along with Thomas Marshall and Donald MacArthur, were gone. Not injured. Not dead in any location that was ever found. Simply absent, from an island with nowhere obvious to go in the middle of a British winter, with no boat missing to explain how they might have left. The subsequent investigation, led by Robert Muirhead, superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Board, produced the closest thing this case has to an official account. And it is, notably, a more measured document than the story's later reputation would suggest. Muirhead's report, filed after his own visit to the island, focused heavily on the lighthouse's logbook, kept in the hand of the keepers themselves, which recorded weather conditions in the days leading up to the disappearance. The entries described severe storms, heavy seas, and on at least one occasion, wind strong enough that the keepers noted concern about the safety of equipment stored near the island's western landing. This is where the case's most enduring and most mundane explanation takes shape. Muirhead's investigation concluded that the most likely sequence of events involved the two more experienced keepers, Ducat and Marshall, going out to secure equipment or check on damage near the western landing during or after a storm. A landing known to be dangerous, positioned at the base of cliffs where a freak wave could sweep across the rocks with little warning, even after a storm had technically passed. Under this reading, MacArthur, the third keeper, went out afterward, either to assist or investigate when the other two didn't return, and all three were caught by a sudden, powerful wave and swept into the sea. Scotland's west coast is known for exactly this kind of danger. So-called freak or rogue waves that can strike a coastline with enough force to sweep a grown man from apparently secure footing. And the western landing at Eilean Moor had, notably, been damaged by such a wave in a storm the following winter, providing at least some corroborating evidence that the location was genuinely hazardous in the way the theory requires. It is, on its own terms, a coherent and relatively unsensational explanation. It does not require malice, nor abandonment, nor anything beyond the genuine, well-documented danger of working near an exposed Atlantic coastline in winter. And for many researchers who have examined the case closely, it remains the most likely account of what happened, even if the specific sequence of events can never be confirmed. And yet, even this measured official version leaves gaps that have kept the case alive for over a century. Why would all three keepers have left the lighthouse at once, in violation of what was understood to be standard procedure? That at least one man should remain on duty, particularly during rough weather, precisely to prevent a situation where no one was left to raise an alarm or assist the others? Why was one bed left unmade, or made hastily, suggesting someone had risen suddenly from sleep or rest in what appeared to be at least mild urgency? And why, in an account that has taken on a life of its own well beyond Muirhead's careful original report, do so many later retellings insist on details? An overturned chair, an untouched meal frozen mid-bite, a sense that the men had left in the middle of something. that seemed to gesture toward a disruption sharper and stranger than 3 men going out to check on storm damage? Some later writers have proposed more unsettling readings, suggesting that the keeper's own behavior in their final log entries hints at something beyond ordinary weather anxiety. That the tone of the last recorded notes, describing one of the keepers as unusually agitated or acting strangely in the days before, points to a psychological unraveling brought on by weeks of extreme isolation, what some have likened to a kind of collective crisis specific to remote station life. It's worth noting that the exact content and tone of these final log entries has been disputed, and in some cases may have been exaggerated or invented entirely in later fictionalized retellings, making it difficult to separate what the keepers actually wrote from what later storytellers wished they had. Further from the shore of plausibility are the theories that have attached themselves to the Flannan Isles precisely because of their old association with St. Flannan's Chapel and the island's reputation among Hebridean fishermen as a place touched by something older than Christianity. Theories invoking maritime folklore about the sea itself reclaiming men who trespass too long on sacred, isolated ground. These readings owe more to the island's centuries-old reputation than to anything found in the physical evidence. But their persistence says something about how thoroughly this case has resisted a single, satisfying resolution. What is certain is only this. 3 men were present on a remote Scottish island in December 1900, tending a light meant to keep other men safe. And then, sometime between the 12th and the 15th, the exact day was never established with certainty, another detail the case never resolved. They were not. No bodies were ever recovered. No boat was ever found bearing them away. The light itself, ironically, had simply gone dark, as if the island had decided on its own terms to stop watching the sea at all. What was it in the end that pulled 3 careful, experienced men away from their post into weather they understood better than almost anyone alive? And what does it mean that the answer, plausible, unglamorous, probably true, has never once been enough to make the story stop being told? Footprints in fresh snow, leading toward a farmhouse and never leading back out again. The farm was called Hinterkaifeck, and it barely sits now since almost nothing of it remains, in a shallow fold of farmland in Bavaria, roughly 40 miles northwest of Munich, isolated even by the standards of rural German homesteads in the early 20th century. There was no village at Hinterkaifeck, not really. The name referred to a single farmstead, connected to the nearest town of Grubern by little more than a dirt track that cut through open fields and a stretch of forest, the kind of walk that made every visit to the farm a deliberate choice, rather than something a person did in passing. It was the kind of place where a stranger's footprints in the snow would be noticed immediately, precisely because no one had any reason to pass that way by accident. The household, in the spring of 1922, consisted of 6 people. Andreas Gruber, 63, owned the farm, a man with a local reputation for being difficult and, by several accounts, for having an inappropriately close relationship with his adult daughter, Victoria Gabriel, 35, a widow. Her husband had reportedly died in the First World War, though rumors in the area suggested her father may in fact have fathered her youngest child, a suspicion that had followed the family for years without ever being resolved or openly confirmed. Living with them was Kazelia Gruber, Andreas's wife, 72, along with Victoria's 2 children, 7-year-old Kazelia, named for her grandmother, and 2-year-old Joseph. A new maid, Maria Baumgartner, had arrived just that day, March 31st, to replace the previous housekeeper, who had reportedly quit after claiming to hear footsteps in the attic and voices in the house that had no obvious source. In the days before Maria's arrival, Andreas Gruber had mentioned something strange to a neighbor. Fresh footprints in the snow leading from the edge of the forest toward the farmhouse. He had followed them part way, he said, and found that they stopped abruptly at the property, without any corresponding tracks leading back out again, as though whoever made them had simply walked up to the house and then vanished, or never left at all. He also reported hearing footsteps in the attic on more than one occasion and finding a newspaper on the property that didn't belong to the household, one nobody in the family could account for. He mentioned, too, that a set of house keys had gone missing sometime before, without explanation. Andreas Gruber did what many people confronted with this accumulation of small, unsettling details might do. He noted them, worried about them in the way one worries about something that doesn't yet feel like a genuine threat, and did not substantially change his routine. It's a decision that, in hindsight, carries a particular weight, because within days, every person on that farm would be dead, and the killer or killers would never be identified. On the last day of March or the first days of April, the exact timeline was reconstructed rather than directly witnessed. All 6 residents of Hinterkaifeck were murdered. The bodies of Andreas, Kazilia, Victoria, and the 7-year-old girl were found in the barn, arranged in a manner that suggested they had been lured or lured themselves there individually rather than attacked as a group, each struck down, investigators determined, with a mattock, a heavy, pickaxe-like farm tool that had apparently been taken from the property itself. The maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had arrived only hours before the killings began, was found dead in her room in the main house. 2-year-old Joseph was found in his crib, also killed, apparently the last victim, based on the state and positioning of the body. What followed the discovery of the bodies, made not immediately but days later on April 4th, when concerned neighbors finally entered the property after noticing the family hadn't been seen and the children hadn't attended school, is, in its own way, nearly as unsettling as the murders themselves. Because the evidence gathered in the days after suggested, with a specificity that has never sat comfortably with investigators, that whoever committed the killings did not leave the farm afterward. There was smoke seen rising from the farmhouse chimney in the days following the murders, smoke that neighbors noticed and, troublingly, did not investigate. The Gruber's dog was found chained but agitated, and when investigators finally searched the house, they found evidence that meals had been prepared and eaten, that the livestock had been fed, that someone, the killer, it is generally presumed, though this has never been confirmed, had continued to live inside the farmhouse, moving among the bodies of 6 murdered people for what may have been several days after the killings took place. This detail alone separates the Hinterkaifeck case from almost any other unsolved crime of its era, and it is the detail that has kept the case alive in German criminology and popular imagination for over a century. It suggests, at minimum, a killer who felt no urgency to flee, who either knew the property well enough to believe they could remain undetected, or who felt some other pull to stay that has never been adequately explained. The official investigation, conducted by Munich police alongside local authorities, produced a substantial list of suspects, but never resulted in a conviction. The most persistent theory centers on Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, officially reported dead on the Western Front years earlier. But, with his death never definitively confirmed through military records available to investigators at the time. Under this theory, Carl Gabriel had in fact survived the war, returned in secret, and discovered, or already suspected, that his wife had borne a child by her own father, and returned to the farm to enact a horrific reckoning against the entire household, remaining afterward perhaps out of some combination of shock, calculation, or a refusal to abandon a home he still considered his own. It's a theory that accounts for the killer's apparent familiarity with the property and willingness to remain there, but it has never been substantiated by any physical evidence connecting Carl Gabriel to the scene, and questions about his actual wartime fate have never been conclusively resolved either way. Other investigators focused closer to home, on Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighboring farmer and former suitor of Victoria's, who was widely rumored to be the biological father of young Joseph rather than Andreas Gruber himself. A rumor that, if true, would give Schlittenbauer a very different motive than the incestuous one usually attached to the case. Schlittenbauer was questioned repeatedly over the years, and his behavior at the scene, reportedly the first to suggest cremating the victims rather than pursuing a fuller investigation, and later legally recognized as Joseph's father in a paternity ruling, struck some investigators as suspicious enough to warrant sustained scrutiny. He was never charged, and no physical evidence was ever produced connecting him definitively to the killings. Beyond these two central theories sit a wider field of speculation that has only grown with time. A wandering vagrant theory, positing that the missing keys and unexplained footprints pointed to an opportunistic drifter who broke into the property, was surprised by the family, and killed them in a panic before remaining to shelter from the cold, though this fails to explain the apparent selectivity and method of the killings. And further still, theories rooted in the area's own folklore, pointing to the family's isolation and reputation for secrecy as evidence of something closer to a curse or a reckoning long in the making. Ideas that owe more to the unsettling atmosphere the case has accumulated over a century than to anything found at the farm itself. The Hinterkaifeck farmhouse itself was demolished in 1923, the year after the murders, its timbers and stones scattered or repurposed, as though the community itself wanted the physical evidence of what had happened there to stop existing. A memorial cross stands near the site today, marking a plot of open farmland where a house, and the small, strange details Andreas Gruber noticed too late to act on, once stood. Cold case investigators reopened the file as recently as 2007, using techniques unavailable in 1922, and even then found nothing conclusive enough to name a killer with confidence. Someone walked to that farmhouse through the snow, left no tracks leading back out, and stayed. For how long and why? No one has ever been able to say for certain, and whoever it was walked away from 6 graves without ever being named. North from the fields of Bavaria, past the Baltic and up along the fjord-cut coast of Norway, the story moves to a valley outside Bergen, where the ground itself would soon earn a name it never had before. Isdalen, the Ice Valley, a rugged stretch of terrain northeast of the city, popular with hikers for its dramatic cliffs and its cold, exposed beauty, and entirely unremarkable until the morning of November 29, 1970. It was a Sunday, and a local professor was hiking through the valley with his 2 young daughters when they came across something that didn't belong to the landscape at all. A body, badly burned, lying among the rocks. The fire that had consumed her had been intense enough that identifying features were almost entirely destroyed, and around the body, investigators found a scattering of objects that seemed at first glance mundane. An umbrella, a pair of rubber boots, a bottle that had once held liquor, and scraps of clothing with their labels deliberately cut out and removed. The woman was never identified. Not that day, not in the 55 years since, despite one of the most extensive forensic and investigative efforts in Norwegian history. She would come to be known, in the absence of anything else to call her, as the Isdal woman, Isdalskvinnen, and the case built around her has become one of Scandinavia's most enduring unsolved mysteries, a file that seems to accumulate more questions the longer anyone looks at it. The autopsy findings were, from the start, difficult to reconcile with each other. The woman had died from a combination of the fire and what appeared to be an overdose of sleeping pills, but investigators also found bruising on her neck consistent with a blow, along with 50 sleeping pills recovered near the scene. Far more than would be needed for the dose found in her system, suggesting either an attempt to disguise the cause of death or a struggle that involved forcing additional pills on her before or after the fire was set. Her fingerprints had been deliberately removed, sanded down, though whether this was done to her before death or represented an old injury was never conclusively settled. Her teeth showed evidence of extensive, high-quality dental work inconsistent with typical Norwegian dental practice of the era, suggesting she had spent significant time and received significant care, somewhere else entirely. What made the case extraordinary wasn't only the circumstances of the body's discovery, but what investigators found when they began retracing her final weeks. In the days before her death, police located 2 suitcases she had left in storage at Bergen's train station, and inside them was a collection of items that read less like the belongings of a tourist and more like the equipment of someone who had spent a great deal of effort constructing a life meant to leave no trace. Clothing with labels removed, exactly as at the crime scene, a pair of glasses with the lenses altered, cash in multiple foreign currencies, and a notebook containing what appeared to be a coded message written in a system investigators were never able to fully decrypt, alongside references to cities across Europe: Paris, Basel, Hamburg, cities she had apparently passed through under a rotating series of at least 8 different aliases, each with its own passport or identification, none of which, when checked against the countries that had ostensibly issued them, corresponded to any real, traceable identity. Hotel staff and acquaintances who had encountered the woman in the weeks before her death described her consistently as elegant, well-dressed, fluent in multiple languages, and evasive about her background in a way that struck several witnesses as deliberate rather than merely private. She had checked into hotels under different names, sometimes rebooking rooms she had just left, apparently for no clear reason. Other guests recalled her requesting room changes late at night, and at least one hotel worker recalled her reacting with visible unease to a couple who followed her too closely on an outing, as though she believed, correctly or not, that she was being watched. All of this, the erased fingerprints, the removed labels, the coded notebook, the rotating aliases, none of which resolved into a verifiable identity, pointed investigators, almost from the earliest days of the case, toward a conclusion that has remained the most widely accepted explanation ever since: that the Isdal woman had been operating as some kind of intelligence agent or spy, and that her death was connected, in ways never fully mapped out, to Cold War espionage activity in a Norway that, as a NATO member bordering the Soviet Union, held genuine strategic value to multiple intelligence services throughout the period. This theory gained further, and stranger, support decades later. Journalists investigating the case in the 2010s uncovered evidence suggesting Norwegian police had, at the time, been instructed by intelligence officials to stand down or limit the scope of their investigation, a claim consistent with sealed files connected to the case that have never been released to the public, officially withheld on grounds of national security, an unusual designation for what was, on paper, an ordinary unsolved death investigation. If the woman had indeed been operating as an intelligence asset, this would explain both the sophistication of her efforts to obscure her identity and the peculiar institutional resistance to solving the case, whether because Norwegian intelligence had its own reasons to avoid drawing attention to her activities, or because identifying her risked exposing an operation, an agency, or a set of allies better left undisclosed. The specific nature of that operation has never been established, and this is where the case fractures into a wider range of speculation. Some researchers have proposed she may have been surveilling or making contact with individuals connected to Norway's growing importance as a testing ground for NATO military exercises during this period, her death the result of a mission that went wrong or a cover that was blown by a rival service. Others have focused on the burn marks and pill overdose as potentially consistent with either a staged suicide meant to look like murder, or a genuine assassination made to resemble one. The ambiguity itself, in this reading, being not an investigative failure, but the intended result, a killing designed specifically to be unresolvable. A more grounded counter-theory, favored by some who have examined the case with an eye toward reducing its more dramatic elements, suggests the woman may not have been a spy in any formal sense at all, but rather someone engaged in smuggling, currency fraud, or another form of serious but non-political criminal activity that would equally explain the false identities, the cash, and the effort to remain untraceable, with her death resulting from a falling out with criminal associates rather than any intelligence operation. This theory accounts for much of the same evidence without requiring state involvement, though it struggles to explain the specific institutional secrecy that has surrounded the case's official files in the decades since, a level of suppression that seems disproportionate to an ordinary criminal case. In 2016, researchers using advanced isotope analysis on remains preserved from the original investigation attempted to narrow down her origins, concluding she had likely spent her early life in a region spanning parts of Central Europe, possibly Germany or France, information that added specificity without ever producing a name. Facial reconstruction efforts, DNA analysis compared against missing persons databases across Europe, and renewed public appeals have all, across more than 5 decades, failed to identify her, an outcome that grows more remarkable rather than less as forensic science itself has advanced around the case without ever managing to close it. She was buried in Bergen under a headstone that, for decades, bore no name at all, only a case number, and later, following renewed investigation and public interest, a marker acknowledging her as the Isdal woman, a designation that has, in the absence of anything truer, become as close to an identity as she has ever been given. Who was she, in the ordinary sense the word usually allows? A daughter, raised somewhere, taught a childhood language, given a name at birth that someone, somewhere, must still remember. And if her death truly was the quiet, deliberate work of an intelligence service sophisticated enough to erase a woman completely, what does it mean that, more than half a century later, whatever files might answer that question remain exactly where they were placed, sealed, unread, and waiting? 8 centuries would pass between the burial of an unnamed woman in a Bergen churchyard and the events this chapter now turns to. But strip away the intervening years, the forensics, the sealed intelligence files, and what's left underneath is a question this collection keeps circling back to in different clothes. What do we do with a person who arrives among us explainable by nothing we already know? In 12th century Suffolk, that question took a form stranger than any spy or vanished truck driver, because the person who arrived wasn't one person, but 2, and they weren't adults with past to reconstruct. They were children, and they were green. The village was Woolpit, a small agricultural settlement in Suffolk, England. Its name derived, most historians agree, from the wolf pits once dug there to trap the animals that threatened medieval livestock, a detail that gives the place a faintly ominous ring even before the strange part of its history begins. It was an ordinary village for its time. Farming land, a scattering of homes, a rhythm of life governed entirely by harvest and season, the kind of place that would have vanished from history entirely if not for what its residents reported witnessing sometime in the middle of the 12th century during the reign of King Stephen, in a period English chroniclers would later describe, without much need for embellishment, as a time when Christ and his saints slept, a England fractured by civil war, uncertain governance, and a level of local chaos that makes the sudden appearance of 2 unexplainable children feel, in hindsight, almost fitting. The story survives because 2 separate medieval chroniclers, writing independently and within decades of the supposed event, both recorded it as established local history rather than rumor or fable. William of Newburgh, writing in his Historia Rerum Anglicarum around 1189, treated the account with open skepticism about its stranger implications while still reporting it as something widely believed to be true. Ralph of Coggeshall, abbot of Coggeshall Abbey, writing his Chronicon Anglicanum in the early 13th century, offered a more detailed version, claiming to have heard the account directly from Sir Richard de Calne, the local landowner who, according to the story, took the children into his household after their discovery. That 2 chroniclers of this period, working from different sources and with different temperaments toward the fantastic, both recorded substantially the same events lends the case a credibility that separates it from the more obviously embellished folklore of the era, even as both accounts agree on details that remain, by any modern standard, very difficult to explain. The story, as both chroniclers tell it, begins during harvest time, when local villagers working the fields near the wolf pits that gave the village its name discovered 2 children emerging from one of the pits, or from a nearby opening in the earth. A boy and a girl, dressed in clothing of an unfamiliar material and unfamiliar color, speaking in a language no one in the village could identify or understand. And their skin, both chroniclers agree without hedging, was green. Not pale, not sickly in a way that suggested ordinary illness the villagers would have recognized, but a genuine green tint, striking enough that it became the defining, inescapable detail of the entire account, the detail that gave the children their name in every retelling since. The villagers, understandably alarmed and unable to communicate with the children, brought them to Sir Richard de Calne's household, the local manor, where they were cared for despite their evident distress. According to Ralph of Coggeshall's account, The children refused all food offered to them for several days, growing weak and increasingly desperate until someone in the household brought in freshly cut green beans, beanstalks, in some translations, or raw bean pods in others, which the children finally accepted, though the chronicle describes them struggling initially to find and extract the beans from the pods themselves, as though unfamiliar with the very shape of the food, before eventually managing to eat. For a period afterward, green beans or similarly green, uncooked vegetable matter apparently remained the only food the children would accept, a detail that has been seized upon by later theorists as significant, though what it might signify has never been agreed upon. The boy, both accounts note grimly, did not survive long after his arrival. He grew increasingly sickly despite being fed, and died sometime after his baptism, which the household apparently arranged for both children once they had integrated somewhat into the community, an act that suggests the villagers, whatever they made of the children's strangeness, ultimately treated them within a Christian framework rather than as something to be feared or expelled. The girl survived, and her account is where the story turns from strange discovery into something closer to genuine testimony. As she gradually learned English over what the chronicles describe as a period of months to years living in the de Caulnay household, she reportedly gave an account of where she and her brother had come from. And it is this account, more than any other single detail, that has made the Green Children of Woolpit endure for nearly 9 centuries as one of England's strangest unresolved stories. She described a land she called St. Martin's Land, a place, she said, where the sun never fully rose, existing in a state of perpetual twilight or dusk, and where, notably, everyone and everything shared the same green coloring she and her brother had arrived with. She described her homeland as separated from ordinary England by a wide river, or in some tellings, a luminous or bright land visible across a body of water or a boundary of some kind, though never one she or her brother had ever crossed or fully understood. She and her brother, she explained, had been tending their father's sheep, some versions say cattle, when they followed the animals into a cave or underground passage and became disoriented, wandering through what she described as a long tunnel filled with the sound of bells, before eventually emerging, disoriented and blinded by unfamiliar sunlight, into the wolf pits near Woolpit. As she grew older, integrated more fully into English life, and eventually lost her green coloring entirely. Both chroniclers note this transformation as though it were an unremarkable expected part of her assimilation, her skin gradually taking on an ordinary human complexion as she adjusted to her new diet and environment. She was baptized, given the name Agnes according to some later traditions, though this specific naming appears in retellings rather than the earliest chronicle sources, and eventually, by most accounts, married a royal official and lived out an otherwise unremarkable adult life in England, her origin as one of the Green Children becoming, by the time she reached adulthood, a matter of local legend rather than immediate scandal. This is where the historical record, remarkably, simply ends. No further account exists of any attempt to locate St. Martin's Land, no additional testimony from the girl beyond what both chroniclers recorded, and no explanation offered by either William of Newburgh or Ralph of Coggeshall beyond their evident belief that they were recording something that had genuinely happened, however inexplicable its details. The most commonly proposed explanation among modern historians centers on the specific historical chaos of the period in which the story is set. The reign of King Stephen, spanning roughly 1135 to 1154, was marked by a civil war so destructive to regional governance and infrastructure that it became known to contemporaries as the Anarchy, a period of widespread violence, famine, and displacement across large parts of England, including East Anglia, the region containing Woolpit. Under this theory, the children were not otherworldly at all, but the orphaned offspring of Flemish immigrants, a substantial population that had settled in parts of eastern England during this period, and who, following a documented massacre of Flemish settlers at the nearby town of Fornham in 1173, may have fled into the countryside, disoriented, malnourished, and speaking a language, Flemish or a related Dutch dialect, that villagers in an isolated agricultural community would genuinely have found completely unintelligible. Their unusual clothing, under this theory, would simply reflect Flemish rather than English fashion of the period, foreign enough to Suffolk villagers to be recorded as strange. The children's green skin in this reading is explained through a real and documented medical condition, hypochromic anemia, sometimes historically called chlorosis, or green sickness, a condition resulting from severe iron deficiency that can, in genuine documented cases, produce a distinct greenish pallor to the skin, particularly when combined with malnutrition of the kind two starving, displaced children fleeing violence and living for an unknown period without adequate food might plausibly have experienced. Under this theory, the children's gradual return to normal coloring as they began eating a stable, varied diet in the DeCounty household isn't a magical transformation at all, but the expected medically documented recovery from a nutritional deficiency resolved once regular food, including foods providing adequate iron, became available to them. This explanation accounts for nearly every detail in the original chronicles without requiring anything beyond the genuine, well-documented horrors of Civil War displacement, malnutrition, and language barriers, which is precisely what has made it the dominant scholarly explanation for the case since it was first proposed in detail in the 20th century. It is, notably, an explanation that fits the evidence about as comprehensively as the freak wave theory fit the Flannan Isles case. Plausible, grounded, medically and historically sound, and yet somehow never quite sufficient to fully close a story that has been told and retold for nearly 900 years, specifically because of its stranger details. Why, skeptics of the Flemish refugee theory ask, would two children fleeing a documented nearby massacre describe their origin not as a real place with a real name known to the local population, but as an entirely invented land of perpetual twilight populated by green-skinned inhabitants, reached by following livestock into an underground tunnel? A story elaborate and internally consistent enough that a young child, even a traumatized and disoriented one, seems an unlikely author for it. And if the explanation is simply childhood trauma reshaping memory into fantasy, why does the girl's account, as recorded by Ralph of Coggeshall decades before her death, remain so consistent in its specific, unusual details, rather than shifting or softening the way half-remembered trauma narratives typically do over time? These gaps have kept alternative theories alive for centuries, ranging from the moderately grounded to the deeply speculative. Some historians have proposed the children may have suffered from arsenic poisoning, which can, in certain cases, produce a greenish skin discoloration alongside other symptoms consistent with the chronicle's description of their initial weakness and eventual recovery once removed from whatever environment had caused the exposure. Though this theory struggles to explain how two children would have shared identical, sustained arsenic exposure, severe enough to visibly alter their skin color while surviving it entirely. Further from consensus are theories that take the girl's own account more literally than modern historians generally allow themselves to. Some researchers, working more within speculative or fringe traditions than academic history, have proposed that St. Martin's Land represents genuine testimony of some kind of parallel or subterranean world, pointing to persistent medieval and early folklore traditions across Britain and Europe describing underground realms, sometimes explicitly linked to fairy or otherworldly beings, and noting that the children's own description, recorded by a chronicler with no evident motive to embellish it, aligns closely with these broader traditions rather than departing from them. These theories don't require believing literally in an underground green world, so much as noting that the consistency between the girl's account and independent folklore traditions she would have had little exposure to as a very young child speaking almost no English is itself a detail worth sitting with, rather than dismissing outright. Others still have proposed more modern reinterpretations, informed by later ufology traditions, suggesting the children's strange coloring, unfamiliar language, unusual clothing, and description of a twilight land might describe something closer to an encounter with genuinely unexplained visitors rather than displaced human refugees at all. a reading that has little to no support within serious historical scholarship, but which persists precisely because the original chronicle accounts, unlike most medieval folklore, were recorded by two chroniclers with reputations for relative sobriety and skepticism, lending the story a documentary weight that most 12th century strange tales simply don't carry. What remains certain across every theory is unusually thin. Two children arrived in a small Suffolk village sometime in the middle of the 12th century, speaking a language no one present could identify, dressed unlike anyone in the region, and colored in a way that every surviving account insists upon without qualification. One died. One lived long enough to learn English, describe her origin in detail, lose her unusual coloring, and disappear into an ordinary adult life that left no further trace of the extraordinary circumstances of her arrival. No modern excavation has ever located a tunnel beneath the old wolf pits at Woolpit. No conclusive genetic, medical, or historical evidence has ever definitively closed the case in favor of any single explanation, refugee, illness, or otherwise. A well still marked in the village today bears the children's name. A quiet local acknowledgement of a story Woolpit has never fully explained and never quite let go of either. Two chroniclers, writing independently, in an age not given to inventing children out of nothing, believed enough of what they were told to write it down as history rather than fable. If the girl's account was simply a child's fear and displacement reshaped into a story that made sense of an unbearable loss, what does it say that the story she told has outlasted the war that likely caused it, the village that sheltered her, and every explanation offered for it since? And if it wasn't? If some fragment of what she described was closer to memory than invention? Where exactly is the boundary she says she crossed, and has anyone in 900 years ever really gone looking for it? That well in Woolpit still holds water today, drawn from ground that's absorbed 9 centuries of a story no one has ever finished. Wells like it dot half of medieval Europe. Quiet civic landmarks, meeting points, sources of the ordinary rhythms of a town. And it's beside a well much like it, in the city of Strasbourg, in the summer of 1518, that this next mystery begins. Not with an arrival, but with a single pair of feet that would not stop moving. Strasbourg in July of 1518 was a prosperous walled city on the banks of the Rhine, part of the Holy Roman Empire, its streets lined with the timber-framed houses and narrow lanes typical of a prosperous free imperial city at the height of its medieval architecture. It had weathered, in the years just before, a punishing sequence of hardships: poor harvests, rising grain prices, and the lingering presence of diseases, including smallpox and syphilis, moving through the population. It was, in other words, a city under real and sustained strain, the kind of place where people were hungry, frightened, and worn thin in ways that would later matter a great deal to how historians have tried to explain what happened next. On or around July 14th, a woman named Frau Trophea stepped into a narrow street in Strasbourg and began to dance. There was no music. There was, as far as any surviving account indicates, no occasion, no celebration, no clear reason for her to have begun at all. And she did not stop. Not after minutes, not after hours. She danced through that first day and into the evening, and when the next morning came, she was, by multiple contemporary accounts, still dancing, her feet moving in a continuous, apparently involuntary motion that showed no sign of exhaustion overcoming her will to stop. Within a week, contemporary chroniclers recorded, roughly 36 other residents of Strasbourg had joined her, each afflicted with the same compulsive, uncontrollable dancing. And within a month, the number had grown, according to the most commonly cited historical accounts, to somewhere between 50 and 400 people, dancing in the streets of Strasbourg simultaneously, day and night, with no apparent ability to stop themselves. This wasn't folklore reconstructed centuries later from vague rumor. The event is documented across an unusually rich body of primary sources for the period: physicians' notes, cathedral sermon records, city council meeting minutes, and chronicles kept by local clergy, all describing with remarkable consistency a phenomenon the city's own authorities were struggling in real time to understand and contain. What makes the Strasbourg outbreak especially difficult to dismiss as later embellishment is the response it provoked from the city's own physicians and civic leaders, whose actions, recorded in council documents, reveal how seriously and how genuinely they believed something dangerous, if inexplicable, was unfolding. Strasbourg's physicians, consulted by an alarmed city council, ruled out possession or astrological causes, and instead diagnosed the affliction as a form of hot blood, a physiological imbalance under the era's prevailing humoral medical theory, and prescribed astonishingly more dancing as the cure, reasoning that the afflicted needed to dance the fever out of their systems rather than be restrained from it. The city council responded by opening guild halls and even constructing a wooden stage in the grain market specifically to accommodate the dancers, and went so far as to hire musicians, pipers, and drummers to provide a rhythm for the afflicted to move to, apparently believing this would hasten their recovery. The result, by nearly every surviving account, was not recovery, but escalation. Providing music and space seemingly encouraged more people to join, either through some contagious element in the dancing itself or through the visible, sanctioned spectacle it had become in the heart of the city. And the human cost of the affliction was, according to physician and chronicler accounts from the period, severe. Dancers reportedly collapsing from exhaustion, suffering strokes and heart attacks, and in some accounts, dying from the sheer physical toll of days of continuous involuntary movement, though exact mortality figures from 1518 remain difficult to verify with full modern confidence given the record-keeping limitations of the era. Alarmed by the outbreak's continued growth and the mounting toll on the afflicted, Strasbourg's authorities eventually reversed course entirely, banning public dancing and music altogether, and instead transported many of the afflicted to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, a saint associated in regional folk tradition with a curse that could compel uncontrollable dancing, located in the nearby town of Saverne. There, the afflicted were reportedly given red shoes to wear, sprinkled with holy water, and led through religious rites specifically intended to break whatever compulsion had taken hold of them. According to the surviving records, this intervention worked. The epidemic gradually subsided in the weeks that followed, the dancing eventually stopping as mysteriously as it had begun, with no definitive explanation offered by the physicians, clergy, or civic authorities who had spent weeks trying to contain it. What makes the 1518 Strasbourg outbreak even more remarkable and considerably harder to dismiss as an isolated, uniquely local phenomenon is that it was not the first nor the last of its kind. Historical records document similar outbreaks of compulsive dancing across medieval and early modern Europe, stretching back centuries before Strasbourg and continuing for some time after. Outbreaks in the Rhineland in 1374, affecting numerous towns along the river, described in chronicle accounts as involving thousands of afflicted dancers moving from town to town. A notable outbreak in the town of Erfurt, and recurring incidents across the German and Dutch lowlands, all sharing the same basic bewildering pattern. Individuals compelled to dance uncontrollably, often for days, sometimes joined by rapidly growing numbers of others, with no clear trigger, no shared underlying illness ever conclusively identified, and no consistent explanation offered even by the physicians and clergy of the time who witnessed it directly. The most widely accepted modern explanation for the Strasbourg outbreak, and for dancing mania more broadly, centers on a phenomenon known as mass psychogenic illness, sometimes called mass hysteria. A documented psychological condition in which extreme collective stress, combined with cultural and religious beliefs that made a dancing curse a plausible expected affliction, can produce genuine involuntary physical symptoms that spread through a population via observation and suggestion rather than any biological pathogen. Under this theory, the extraordinary hardship Strasbourg's population had endured in the years leading up to 1518, famine, disease, high mortality, deep uncertainty about the future, created exactly the psychological conditions in which a susceptible individual, whether Frau Trofea or someone before her whose name never survived, could enter a genuine dissociative or trance-like state, and in a culture that already believed strongly in the reality of dancing curses tied to St. Vitus. That behavior could spread through observation to others already primed by stress and belief to interpret their own anxious, exhausted bodies through the same lens. This theory is bolstered by comparison to other well-documented cases of mass psychogenic illness in more recent history, phenomena where genuine physical symptoms have spread through populations via psychological and social contagion, rather than any biological agent, lending real scientific credibility to the idea that something similar, amplified by the specific religious and medical beliefs of 1518, could produce an outbreak on the scale Strasbourg experienced. A second, chemically focused theory has circulated for decades in popular retellings of the case, attributing the dancing to ergot poisoning, a toxic mold that grows on damp rye and other grains, capable of producing convulsions, hallucinations, and spasmodic muscle movements in those who consume contaminated bread, and historically responsible for other, well-documented outbreaks of mass illness across medieval Europe. Given the poor harvests and grain conditions Strasbourg had recently endured, the theory holds a surface plausibility. Most historians who have examined the case closely, however, consider ergot poisoning a poor fit for the specific sustained behavior described in the primary sources. Ergotism typically produces violent, uncoordinated convulsions and severe circulatory symptoms, including gangrene in extreme cases, rather than the sustained, purposeful, rhythmic dancing that could continue for days at a stretch. And the theory struggles to explain why an outbreak of food poisoning would manifest as specifically dance-like movement rather than the more chaotic, undirected symptoms ergotism produces in every other well-documented historical case. A third strand of explanation looks not to psychology or toxicology, but to the religious framework the afflicted physicians and civic authorities themselves already believed in. St. Vitus, in regional folk Catholicism, was understood to have the power to curse individuals with compulsive dancing as a punishment for some transgression, real or perceived. And under this reading, the outbreak may have functioned as a kind of collective, culturally sanctioned ritual of atonement, particularly plausible in a population already primed by famine and disease to interpret their suffering through a framework of divine punishment and the need for penance. This theory doesn't necessarily compete with the mass psychogenic illness explanation so much as provide its cultural mechanism, explaining not just why people might have been psychologically vulnerable to such an episode, but why it took the specific shape of dancing rather than any of the other physical manifestations mass hysteria has produced in other documented historical contexts. What none of these theories fully explains, even taken together, is the sheer physical severity and duration described in the primary sources. Dancers who, according to multiple independent chroniclers, continued for days without rest, to the point of physical collapse and, in some accounts, death. Modern mass psychogenic illness, however genuine and well documented as a psychological phenomenon, rarely produces symptoms severe enough to be independently fatal, which has left some researchers proposing that the true explanation may lie in some combination of factors historians haven't yet fully reconciled. Genuine psychological contagion, amplified and worsened by the civic response of providing music and a public stage, compounded further by the physical toll of days of continuous exertion on bodies already weakened by the very famine and hardship that made the population psychologically vulnerable in the first place. Under this reading, the city's own well-intentioned intervention, encouraging the afflicted to dance rather than restraining them, may have transformed a genuine but survivable psychological episode into something considerably more dangerous. A tragic feedback loop in which the cure prescribed for the affliction became one of its most severe complications. Beyond the medical and psychological explanation sits a smaller body of more speculative theory, largely outside mainstream historical scholarship, pointing to the broader pattern of dancing manias recurring across Europe over several centuries as evidence of something less easily reduced to isolated local stressors, proposing instead some shared, unidentified environmental trigger, whether a specific toxin, a undocumented pathogen, or a psychological vulnerability embedded deeply enough in medieval European culture that it resurfaced predictably whenever conditions of extreme collective stress aligned with the right cultural beliefs about dancing curses and saints. These theories remain difficult to test against evidence that is, by nature of the period, incomplete and unevenly recorded, and most historians remain cautious about drawing firm causal lines between outbreaks separated by decades or centuries and occurring in different regions under different specific conditions. What the surviving records make clear, across every theory offered, is that Strasbourg's authorities took the outbreak extremely seriously, spent considerable civic resources attempting to address it, tried multiple contradictory interventions in succession as earlier ones failed, and ultimately watched it end, not through any confirmed cure, but through a pilgrimage and a religious rite whose actual mechanism of success, if it had one beyond simple coincidence with the episode's natural conclusion, was never established by anyone who witnessed it. Frau Trofea herself disappears from the historical record almost as completely as she entered it. No account of what became of her after the shrine at Saverne. No explanation offered even by her own contemporaries for why she, specifically, was the one to begin dancing in that narrow Strasbourg street on an ordinary July day. She is, in the end, less a fully drawn historical figure than a fixed point. The moment before, when the street was quiet, and the moment after, when it wasn't. What made one woman's feet begin moving on an unremarkable day in July, in a city already worn down by years of suffering it hadn't chosen? And if hundreds of others, in the weeks that followed, felt some version of the same compulsion take hold of their own bodies without their consent? What exactly were they responding to? Her, the music the city provided, the suffering they already carried, or something in that summer air that medieval Strasbourg, for all its careful record-keeping, never managed to name? A house with no answer at its door, a search for men who could not be found. Wolverton Street left us with an empty room and a silence no one could explain. Now that silence widens, from a single parlor on a city street to the full breadth of the Atlantic Ocean, where an entire crew, not just one victim, seems to have stepped out of existence and left no trace of the leaving. On the last day of January, 1921, a 5-masted commercial schooner ran hard aground on the outer edge of Diamond Shoals, a treacherous stretch of shifting sand off the coast of North Carolina, so notorious among sailors that it had earned the nickname, the Graveyard of the Atlantic. Her sails were still set, full and taut, catching a wind that was driving her further onto the shoal with every passing hour. Her lifeboats were gone. Her navigation equipment, her logbook, and her anchors were missing. And of the 11 men who had sailed her from Rio de Janeiro weeks earlier, not one could be found. Not aboard, not in the water, not anywhere along the coast in the days and weeks that followed. The ship was the Carroll A. Deering, and to this day, no one knows for certain what happened to her crew. The Deering was, in early 1921, an unremarkable commercial vessel doing an entirely ordinary job. Built in 1919 in Bath, Maine, she was a large schooner used to haul cargo along the eastern seaboard and across the Atlantic. In the summer of 1920, she had sailed from Norfolk, Virginia to Rio de Janeiro, laden with coal, under the command of Captain William Merritt and his son, First Mate Sewell Merritt. But Captain Merritt fell ill shortly after departure and left the ship at Lewis, Delaware, taking his son with him for medical treatment. In his place, the ship's owners appointed a replacement. 66-year-old Captain Willis T. Wormel, an experienced sailor with a long and respected career, and a new first mate, Charles B. McClellan. It was, by several accounts, not an entirely harmonious arrangement. McClellan reportedly had a reputation for heavy drinking and a volatile temper, and at least one account, offered later by the captain of another vessel who encountered the Deering in Rio, suggested that McClellan had been overheard making threatening remarks about Captain Wormel during a stopover, reportedly boasting that he would get the captain before the voyage was through. Wormel, for his part, was said to have confided to a friend in Rio that he found his relationship with his mate strained and that he worried about the crew's discipline more broadly. Whether this was the ordinary friction of a long voyage under an unfamiliar chain of command, or something with darker undertones, is impossible to say with any certainty. No formal complaint was filed. No incident report was made. It exists in the record only as testimony gathered after the fact, filtered through memory and speculation. The Deering departed Rio de Janeiro in early December 1920, sailing empty of cargo, bound for Norfolk. The voyage north was, as far as anyone could later determine, unremarkable, until she reached home waters. On January 23, 1921, the Deering was reported passing Cape Lookout, North Carolina, apparently without incident. Then, on January 28th, the lightship stationed at Cape Lookout Shoals made contact with her. A crewman aboard the Deering, described by the lightship's keeper, Captain Thomas Jacobson, as a thin man with reddish hair and an unusual accent, someone Jacobson did not recognize as any of the ship's regular officers, hailed the lightship through a megaphone to report that the Deering had lost both of her anchors in a recent storm, and asked that the message be relayed to the ship's owners. Jacobson later gave an account that has become one of the case's most quoted and most debated details. He said the crewman appeared oddly composed, even casual, given the circumstances, and that he could see other crew members moving about the deck behind him in what struck him, in retrospect, as an unusually relaxed and informal manner for men reporting a genuine emergency. Some of them, he thought, gathered near the forward area of the ship in a way that seemed inconsistent with the normal, rigid discipline of a working vessel. He noted, too, that the man doing the hailing was not dressed as an officer would typically dress, and did not use the ship's normal chain of communication. Customarily, such a message would come from the captain or first mate, not an ordinary seaman. Jacobson's ship had no functioning radio equipment strong enough to relay the message immediately, and by the time he was able to pass it along through another vessel, the Deering had already sailed on, disappearing over the horizon to the north. It was the last confirmed contact anyone would ever have with a living member of her crew. 2 days later, on the morning of January 31st, 1921, a Coast Guard surfman at the Cape Hatteras station spotted the Deering, sails still fully set, run aground on the outer edge of Diamond Shoals, a position roughly consistent with a ship that had continued sailing, unmanned or uncontrolled, well past the point where any competent crew would have intervened. Rough seas and severe weather made it impossible for rescue boats to reach her for several days. It was not until March 4th, more than a month later, that a boarding party was finally able to reach the wreck. What they found deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. The ship's 2 lifeboats were gone, along with the ship's navigation equipment, her charts, her logbook, and both anchors. Consistent, at least, with the anchor loss reported to the lightship. In the galley, food had reportedly been laid out as though a meal were in preparation or had recently been abandoned mid-task. The ship's steering mechanism appeared to have been deliberately damaged or disabled. Personal belongings of the crew, however, were still aboard. Clothing, in some accounts, still hanging in place, suggesting the men had not left with any deliberate plan to abandon ship for good, or had left in a hurry with no time to gather their possessions. There was no sign of violence, no blood, no struggle. No bodies were ever found, not aboard the Deering, not washed ashore along the Carolina coast, not recovered by any of the extensive search efforts launched by the Coast Guard and Navy in the weeks that followed. 11 men, the entire complement of the ship's crew, had vanished as completely as if the ship had simply sailed out from beneath them. The most straightforward explanation offered at the time was mutiny. The tension between Captain Wormel and First Mate McClellan, reported secondhand by witnesses in Rio, offered investigators a motive, however thin, and the missing lifeboats suggested the crew had left the ship deliberately, under their own power, rather than being swept away or lost at sea. Under this theory, the crew, perhaps led by McClellan, perhaps in the midst of some dispute that escalated beyond the captain's control, seized the ship, possibly harmed or overthrew Wormel, and then abandoned the Deering near shore, either to escape by lifeboat to land or with the intention of being picked up by another vessel entirely, disappearing into new identities along the coast or aboard a ship bound elsewhere. It is a theory with real evidentiary support, but also real gaps. If the crew mutinied and escaped by lifeboat, why has no trace of them, alive or dead, ever surfaced in over a century of searching? Small lifeboats attempting a landing on the rough winter seas near Diamond Shoals would have faced serious risk of capsizing, and yet no wreckage matching the Deering's boats was ever recovered either. A second mainstream theory points to piracy, and specifically to the illegal rum-running trade that flourished along the American coast in the earliest years of Prohibition, which had taken effect just over a year before the Deering's final voyage. Under this theory, the ship may have been boarded by rum runners or opportunistic criminals, her crew killed or taken captive, and the vessel then deliberately run aground or abandoned after being looted of anything valuable. Though what, precisely, an empty cargo ship carrying no goods would have offered such attackers remains difficult to explain. Some researchers have connected this theory to another vessel, the SS Hewitt, which disappeared in the same waters around the same time without a trace, speculating that both ships may have fallen victim to the same group of pirates or rum runners operating actively off the Carolina coast that winter. If true, it would suggest a far more organized and violent criminal enterprise working the shipping lanes than official investigations ever fully substantiated, though no wreckage, no confession, and no captured pirate crew ever emerged to confirm it. It is worth pausing, at this point in the investigation, to consider a detail that seems almost too deliberately ambiguous to be coincidence: the unidentified crewman who hailed the lightship. Captain Jacobson's testimony was unusually specific for what should have been a routine at-sea exchange. He described a man who did not match any of the officers he had previously seen aboard the Deering during earlier encounters, speaking with what he believed was a distinctly non-American accent, behaving with what struck him as an oddly casual confidence for someone reporting the loss of both anchors. A serious operational failure for any ship. Was this simply an ordinary seaman? One of several crew members Jacobson had never had reason to observe closely before, relaying a routine message in an unremarkable way that only seemed strange in hindsight after everything that followed? Or was it someone else entirely? Someone who did not belong on the Deering's manifest at all? This detail fed one of the case's more persistent theories, that the Deering's crew, by the time she passed the lightship, was no longer entirely her original crew. That somewhere between Rio de Janeiro and Cape Lookout, the ship had encountered other men, and that whatever happened to the original crew had already begun. Adding to the strangeness, the U.S. government's own investigation would later take an unexpected diplomatic turn. Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes formally requested assistance from several governments, including the Soviet Union, after suspicion briefly fell on a Russian crewed steamer, the SS Hewitt among the vessels considered, and rumors circulated of a mysterious black-hulled steamer spotted trailing the Deering in the days before she ran aground. A vessel other mariners in the area reported sighting, but which was never definitively identified or located. Was this steamer connected to the Deering's fate, some waiting predator that had shadowed her up the coast? Or was it simply another anonymous ship going about its own business, seen in passing and later woven into the story by investigators desperate for any lead at all? No account of the Deering mystery is complete without mentioning perhaps its most tantalizing and most disputed piece of evidence. A message reportedly found inside a bottle washed ashore on the North Carolina coast some months after the wreck, allegedly written by the ship's engineer, describing the vessel being boarded and the crew held captive. The note caused a brief sensation when it surfaced. It was, however, later determined by at least one investigation to likely be a hoax, possibly perpetrated by a local prankster, though even this conclusion has been disputed by some researchers who argue the note's dismissal was never as conclusively proven as official reports suggested. Was it a fabrication, seized upon by a public hungry for answers to fill the silence the case had left behind? Or did it carry some fragment of truth that official channels, eager to close an embarrassing and unsolved file, were simply unwilling to pursue? In the decades since, the Deering has taken on a kind of second life in the folklore of the Bermuda Triangle, occasionally listed alongside other vanished ships and aircraft as evidence of some unexplained force at work along the Atlantic seaboard. Though the Deering's wreck site at Diamond Shoals lies well outside the traditional bounds most researchers draw around the triangle itself. Some fringe theorists have speculated about rogue waves, sudden and inexplicable weather phenomena, or even less conventional explanations entirely, arguing that the sheer completeness of the crew's disappearance, no bodies, no lifeboats found, no confirmed sightings of the men alive on land, resists any of the mundane explanations offered by mutiny or piracy alike. The U.S. government's official investigation, running across multiple federal agencies including the Department of Justice, the Coast Guard, and the Department of Commerce, ultimately closed without ever reaching a definitive conclusion. The most widely accepted theory today remains some combination of mutiny and piracy. The two are not, after all, mutually exclusive, but most widely accepted is a considerable distance from proven. The wreck of the Carroll A. Deering was eventually deemed a hazard to navigation and dynamited by the Coast Guard in 1922, her remains scattered across the shoal that had claimed her. Whatever physical evidence might have remained to answer the questions investigators never resolved was destroyed along with the hull itself. What happened to Captain Wormel, and to Charles McClellan, and to the 9 other men who sailed north from Rio de Janeiro that winter? Did they meet violence at each other's hands somewhere on the open water, their bodies claimed by a sea that offers no ledger of the dead it keeps? Were they taken, captured by other men for reasons of profit or malice we may never fully understand, and carried off to fates no record has ever traced? Or does some other truth remain out there still, as unresolved and unrecovered as the ship's own logbook, last seen aboard a drifting schooner and never seen again? Leave behind whatever wind-swept coastline or candlelit chamber closed our last chapter, and travel now to a different kind of darkness. Not the wilderness, but the terraced streets of industrial England, where fog rolls in off the Mersey and gaslight flickers against wet brick. We move from open land to a locked room, from centuries-old legend to a case so recent, so meticulously documented, that detectives still argue over its details in academic journals today. This is Liverpool, in the winter of 1931. The house sits at 29 Wolverton Street, in the Anfield district of Liverpool, a modest 2-up, 2-down terrace, indistinguishable from 100 others on the same row. Red brick, a small front parlor, a narrow staircase, the kind of house where nothing, by all appearances, should ever happen. On the evening of January 20th, 1931, something happened there that has never been fully explained. Inside that parlor, on the hearthrug in front of the fireplace, a woman named Julia Wallace lay dead. She had been struck at least 11 times about the head with a blunt weapon, most likely a length of iron pipe, or something very like it, in an attack so violent that blood had sprayed in an upward arc across the wall and mantelpiece. She was 52 years old, a quiet, cultured woman who gave piano lessons and kept to herself. Her murder would become one of the most studied unsolved crimes in English criminal history. Not because it was especially gruesome, though it was, but because of a single, maddening question that investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths have wrestled with for nearly a century. Where was her husband when it happened? And more troublingly, could he have done it and still have been telling the truth? To understand why this case still unsettles people who study it, we have to go back one day earlier, to a chess club, a telephone call, and a message left for a man who did not exist. William Herbert Wallace was 52 years old in January 1931, an insurance agent for the Prudential Assurance Company, collecting weekly premiums door to door across the working-class neighborhoods of Liverpool. By most accounts, he was a reserved, almost old-fashioned man, fond of chess, amateur chemistry, and quiet evenings at home with Julia, to whom he had been married for over 15 years. Neighbors described the couple as devoted, if unremarkable. There was no scandal attached to their name, no debts of any real consequence, no whispered affairs. On the evening of Monday, January 19th, the night before the murder, Wallace was at his regular haunt, the Liverpool Central Chess Club, playing in a scheduled tournament match. At around 7:15 p.m., a telephone call came into the club. The club steward, a man named Samuel Beatty, took the call. The voice on the other end asked whether Wallace was present, and when told he was mid-game, asked that a message be passed along. A man named R.M. Qualtrough wished to see Wallace the following evening at 7:30 p.m. at an address in the Mossley Hill district, 25 Menlove Gardens East, regarding a matter of business. Wallace came to the phone himself moments later, but by then the caller had hung up. He did not recognize the name Qualtrough. He had never heard of him, and yet the message was specific enough and plausible enough. A prospective client wanting to discuss an insurance policy was hardly unusual for a man in his profession, that Wallace apparently gave it little more thought than a minor inconvenience to be dealt with the next day. Here is where the case begins to fold in on itself, because everything hinges on timing, on telephone exchanges, and on the movements of a man who may have been walking into a trap, walking away from a crime, or simply walking. An insurance agent doing his job on an ordinary winter night. The following evening, January 20th, Wallace set out around 6:45 p.m. to find Menlove Gardens East. He would later testify, and several independent witnesses would confirm parts of his account, that he asked directions from at least 4 different people: a tram conductor, a police constable, a newspaper vendor, and a local resident. None of them could direct him to the address, for a simple and unsettling reason. No such street existed. There was a Menlove Gardens north, south, and west in that part of the city, but no east. Wallace wandered the unfamiliar streets for the better part of 45 minutes, growing increasingly frustrated before giving up and returning home. He arrived back at Wolverton Street sometime around 8:45 p.m. According to his account, the front door was locked, unusual since Julia typically left it on the latch when she expected him, and the back door, when he tried it, also would not open. He knocked. He tried again. Finally, going around to the back alley a second time, he found the back door now open and stepped inside to find the house cold, gas lamps unlit in the front room, and his wife dead on the parlor floor. He alerted neighbors, John and Florence Johnston, who lived 2 doors down and happened to be stepping out of their own home at that exact moment. Together they summoned the police. What the investigators found puzzled them from the start. Julia Wallace had been killed with tremendous, almost frenzied force, the kind of violence that typically leaves the attacker heavily blood-stained. And yet whoever committed the murder appeared to have left almost no trace. A Macintosh raincoat belonging to William Wallace was found partially beneath the body, badly burned in places and stained with blood, leading some investigators to theorize the killer had worn it as a makeshift smock to avoid being marked, then discarded it at the scene. But if that were true, if the killer had taken such care, why leave the coat behind at all, in a house they'd presumably had every opportunity to search or clean? Robbery seemed at first a plausible motive. A cash box that Wallace kept for his insurance collections was found rifled through, and roughly 4 pounds was reported missing. A meaningful sum in 1931, but hardly a fortune worth killing for. And strangely, other more obviously valuable items in the house, including Julia's jewelry, were left untouched. And then there was the question of time. Police established, through witness testimony and Julia's own habits, that she was likely killed sometime between 6:30 and 8 p.m., a window that overlapped uncomfortably with the very hours Wallace claimed to have spent wandering Mossley Hill in search of a fictitious address on a fictitious street. Investigators were left with a deeply uncomfortable set of facts. If Wallace was innocent, then someone had gone to extraordinary lengths, placing a phone call from a public call box roughly a quarter mile from the Wallace home, using a false name and a non-existent address, purely to lure him away from the house for the precise window in which his wife would be murdered. That would mean the killer knew Wallace's evening chess club schedule, knew he would be reachable there, and had engineered an elaborate alibi-breaking scheme with almost surgical precision. But if Wallace was guilty, if he had in fact murdered his wife himself, then he would have needed to commit an extremely violent, blood-spattering crime, wash and dispose of any bloodied clothing with no apparent trace, alter the household clocks or timeline convincingly, and then rush across the city to establish an alibi built around a wild goose chase that he himself seemed to design to fail. Why invent a search so bizarre, so easily disprovable, so certain to draw suspicion, if the entire purpose was to protect himself? Both explanations examined closely strain against their own logic. And that tension, the sense that neither guilt nor innocence fully accounts for the evidence, is precisely why the Wallace case has never stopped generating theories. Perhaps the most scrutinized detail in the entire case is the telephone call itself, the one placed to the chess club under the name Qualtro. Telephone engineers for the prosecution testified that the call had been made from a public call box near the Wallace home, roughly 400 yards from Wolverton Street. This detail became central to the prosecution's theory, that Wallace himself had placed the call, stepping briefly away from the chess club earlier that evening. He had, after all, arrived slightly late to his match, to set up the alibi that would supposedly clear him the following night. The defense countered that Wallace had barely enough time to slip out, make the call, and return without his absence being noticed by fellow chess players. And predictably, several club members testified they had not seen him leave. Handwriting experts were even brought in to examine an old scorecard on which the name and appointment details had allegedly been jotted down by Wallace in his own hand, in what the prosecution suggested was a clumsy attempt to make the appointment appear to have been arranged in advance and in good faith. Was the call really made by Wallace? Or was it made by someone else entirely? Someone who knew enough about Wallace's Monday night routine, his employer's cash collection schedule, and the layout of the house to construct an elaborate ruse. The call box was a 15-minute walk from the chess club, a demanding but not impossible errand for a man determined enough. No conclusive answer was ever reached, and it never would be. Wallace was arrested on February 2, 1931, and charged with his wife's murder. The case against him was entirely circumstantial. No witness placed him at the scene during the window of the murder, no physical evidence definitively linked him to the crime, and no clear motive was ever established beyond vague suggestions of an unhappy marriage that virtually every witness who knew the couple firmly disputed. Nevertheless, the trial, held in April 1931, ended in a guilty verdict, and Wallace was sentenced to death. What happened next was almost unprecedented in English legal history. Wallace's defense appealed the verdict, and in May 1931, the Court of Criminal Appeal overturned the conviction, not merely ordering a retrial, but quashing the guilty verdict outright on the grounds that it was not supported by the evidence. It remains, to this day, one of the earliest instances in English legal history of an appellate court overturning a murder conviction, purely because the evidence, taken as a whole, could not reasonably sustain it. Wallace walked free, but he would never be cleared in the eyes of the public, and Liverpool never fully welcomed him back. He was shunned by neighbors, his employer quietly eased him into a desk position away from the public, and his health, already fragile from a kidney condition, began to fail. William Herbert Wallace died less than 2 years later, in February 1933, having spent his final months largely alone, still insisting, to the very end, according to those closest to him, that he had never harmed his wife, and that he had no idea who had. If he was innocent, he died having watched his community convict him anyway, in whispers, long after the courts had not. If he was guilty, he took the truth of that January evening to his grave without ever once wavering in his denial. Which was it? For decades, one name has recurred in nearly every serious re-examination of the Wallace case: Richard Gordon Parry. Parry was a young man in his early 20s who had once worked alongside Wallace collecting insurance premiums for the same firm, and who was known to Julia Wallace personally. He had visited the house before. By several accounts, Parry had recently been dismissed, or nearly dismissed, from his position after discrepancies were discovered in his collection accounts, and he was known locally as someone with a taste for petty theft and a volatile temperament. Crucially, Perry would have known the layout of the Wallace home, Julia's routine of answering the door to acquaintances without suspicion, and enough about Wallace's schedule and employer to potentially construct the Qualtrough ruse. In the years following the trial, several individuals came forward with claims connecting Perry more directly to the crime. A woman named Lily Lloyd, who had been engaged to Perry at the time, reportedly told acquaintances that Perry had arrived at her home on the night of the murder in a state of visible agitation, with blood on his clothing, and had asked her to help him lie about his whereabouts. A garage mechanic named John Parks, who served Perry's car for cleaning some days after the murder, later claimed, decades after the fact, in an interview given only after Perry's death in 1980, that he had found a blood-stained glove wedged in the car and a bloodied mallet, and that when he mentioned it, Perry had reacted with something between panic and menace, warning him to keep quiet if he valued his life. These accounts, compelling as they are, share a common and frustrating limitation. They surfaced years, in some cases decades after the fact, from witnesses who, for understandable reasons given Perry's reported temperament, had stayed silent while he was alive. Perry himself was interviewed by police at the time and had an alibi corroborated by several people, including his fiancée. He was never charged. He lived out the rest of his life in relative obscurity, and died never having been formally connected to the crime by law. Was Perry the man behind the voice on the telephone? Did he know Julia Wallace well enough that she might have opened the door to him without a second thought on a cold January evening, never suspecting the visit would be her last? Or has the case over 90 years simply absorbed him as a convenient villain, a name onto which the unanswered pieces of the puzzle could be hung, if only because somebody had to be blamed, and it could not comfortably remain the grieving, dying husband the courts had already released? Adding yet another layer of intrigue is the figure of Superintendent Hubert Moore, one of the lead detectives on the case, and more notably, Chief Inspector John Herbert Roberts. But it is the crime writer and broadcaster Roger Wilkes who devoted years of independent investigation to the Wallace case in the 1980s, whose work perhaps most reshaped public understanding of it. Wilkes tracked down surviving witnesses, located the aging John Parks for what would become a widely cited recorded interview, and argued forcefully in his research that Perry, not Wallace, was almost certainly responsible. Yet even Wilkes, thorough as his investigation was, could not produce anything resembling definitive proof. No confession, no forensic link. Only the accumulated weight of testimony offered was too late to be tested in any court by witnesses whose memories had had 50 years to shift, sharpen, or soften in the retelling. This is perhaps the defining texture of the Wallace case. Everyone who studies it closely arrives at a theory they find persuasive, and no one, not the original jury, not the appellate judges, not the true crime writers who followed for the next 90 years, has ever been able to close the file. Beyond the central question of guilt, the Wallace case is dense with smaller peculiarities that continue to invite speculation. There is the curious matter of the milk boy, Alan Close, who delivered milk to the Wallace household that evening and later testified he saw Julia alive and spoke briefly with her at approximately 6:30 p.m., a detail that, if precisely accurate, narrows the window for murder considerably and places enormous pressure on Wallace's timeline for reaching the chess club, making his guilt, in the eyes of some analysts, almost mathematically implausible. Other witnesses place the milk delivery slightly later, and the discrepancy of even a few minutes has been argued over by forensic timeline reconstructionists for generations. There is the detail of the fire. The front parlor fire was found still burning, hot enough that investigators believed it had been recently tended. An odd detail if Julia had, as the defense suggested, ushered a visitor into the room and been attacked almost immediately, with little time to settle in. There is the undisturbed cat. Julia was known to be fond of the family's cat, and the animal was found calm and unharmed in the house. A small, almost sentimental detail, but one that criminologists have noted might suggest the household was not disturbed by a struggle loud enough or long enough to frighten it before the fatal blows were struck, hinting the attack may have come with unusual suddenness. And there is the pipe itself, or rather, the absence of one. Despite an extensive search, the actual murder weapon was never recovered. Investigators believed it to be an iron bar of some kind, but nothing matching that description was ever found in the house, the surrounding streets, nearby drains, or the Mersey itself, despite dredging efforts. A killer who had time to conceal a weapon so thoroughly in the middle of winter, in an unfamiliar or hurried state. What does that suggest about how much time they truly had, and how calm they truly were? Nearly a century on, the Julia Wallace murder remains a fixture not just of British criminal history, but of criminology courses and detective fiction alike. Raymond Chandler himself once called it the impossible murder, insoluble not for lack of evidence, but because of what he described as its perfect, maddening symmetry. Every fact that pointed toward Wallace's guilt was mirrored by a fact that undermined it, and every argument for his innocence carried within it the seed of its own doubt. Was William Herbert Wallace a wronged man, driven from his home and his health by a city that convicted him in whispers long after the law had set him free? Or was he something colder, a methodical man who built, with his knowledge of chess and chemistry alike, an alibi so strange that its very strangeness became its camouflage, hiding in plain sight behind its own implausibility? And if it was not Wallace, if somewhere in Liverpool that January evening, a young man with a grudge and a bloodied glove made a telephone call using a name that existed nowhere else, to lure a woman's husband away just long enough, did that man live out the rest of his life in the same city, passing perhaps within blocks of the house on Wolverton Street, carrying a secret that no one could ever quite prove, and no one could ever quite let go? The house at 29. Wolverton Street still stands today. Though it has changed hands many times, its interior long since renovated beyond recognition. Nothing marks it as the site of anything unusual. And perhaps that too is part of what makes this case endure. Not a haunted castle, not a vanished ship, but an ordinary terraced house on an ordinary street, where an ordinary evening ended in a violence so precise, so carefully bracketed by an impossible appointment and a non-existent address, that even now we are left only to wonder who really knocked on Julia Wallace's door, and whether, somewhere in the silence that followed, the truth was buried along with her. Every mystery so far in this collection has needed a document, a body, a photograph, something solid enough to argue about. This next one turns that expectation upside down. Its central witness was a single trapper, alone in one of the most remote regions on the North American continent, and what he says he found there has been debated for 70 years without ever producing so much as a single confirmed grave. His name was Joe LaBelle, and the story he told would become one of the coldest, strangest missing persons cases ever attached to Canadian soil. Angikuni Lake sits deep in the Kavalik region of what is now Nunavut, in Canada's central Arctic, a vast, ice-carved body of water surrounded by barren tundra so remote that even today it remains accessible only by float plane or an extraordinarily long overland trek. In the 1930s, when this story is set, it existed almost entirely outside the reach of Canadian federal record-keeping, known primarily to the Inuit people who had traveled and hunted across the region for generations, and to the small handful of fur trappers, most of them itinerant and independent, who worked the same unforgiving territory in pursuit of pelts to trade at the nearest Hudson's Bay Company posts, themselves often hundreds of miles away. According to the story as it has been told and retold since, Joe LaBelle, a trapper of French-Canadian origin working the region around Angikuni Lake, arrived at a small Inuit encampment on the lake's shore sometime in November 1930, a settlement he claimed to have visited before and knew to be home to a group numbering, in various versions of the account, somewhere between 25 and 30 people. What he found there, he later reported, was a village frozen in the exact moment its inhabitants had been living in, with no one left to inhabit it at all. The tents in LaBelle's account stood intact, their skin coverings undisturbed by weather or time in a way that suggested a very recent abandonment rather than a settlement left to decay over an extended period. Inside, he reported finding food still in cooking pots, as though meals had been abandoned mid-preparation. Clothing remained folded or hung inside the shelters. Most troubling of all, in every version of the story that has survived, LaBelle claimed to have found the sled dogs of the village, still tied and dead, reportedly of starvation, having been left tethered with no one to feed or release them, a detail that, if true, indicated the village's inhabitants had not simply relocated in an orderly fashion, taking their essential belongings and animals with them, but had left with an abruptness that made no practical sense for people whose survival depended entirely on careful, deliberate preparation for the Arctic environment around them. LaBelle also reported finding rifles left behind in several of the tents, a detail that, to anyone familiar with subsistence life in the Arctic, reads as almost as strange as the abandoned dogs. A rifle, in this environment and era, represented an irreplaceable and essential tool for survival, hunting, and defense. Leaving one behind voluntarily, particularly during a journey into unfamiliar or dangerous territory, would have been an extraordinary decision for people whose lives depended on exactly this kind of equipment. Perhaps the most widely repeated detail from the story, and the one that has done the most to keep it circulating in the decades since, involves what LaBelle claimed to find near the encampment. Several graves, marked by the traditional stone cairns used across the region to protect burial sites from scavenging animals, which appeared to have been disturbed or opened from within rather than from without. The stones displaced in a manner LaBelle interpreted as inconsistent with animal activity, and inconsistent too with anything he could otherwise explain. According to his account, when the graves were examined, they were found empty. Alarmed by what he had found, LaBelle reported traveling to alert Canadian authorities, and the story holds that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, alongside a Canadian Army unit, launched an investigation into the missing village, a search effort that, according to the most elaborate versions of the tale, extended across the surrounding tundra for weeks without locating a single member of the vanished community, living or dead. Some retellings go further still, incorporating a strange coda. Unusual lights reported in the sky above the region around the same period, witnessed by pilots and locals alike, which some versions of the story link directly to the village's disappearance, suggesting a connection between the sightings and whatever befell Angikuni's inhabitants, without ever specifying what that connection might actually be. This is where the story, as it circulates in the form most audiences encounter it today, generally ends. An entire community erased from a frozen landscape, its animals starved, its weapons abandoned, its dead apparently risen from opened graves, and no official explanation ever produced despite a substantial federal investigation. It's also, and this needs to be addressed as directly and as early as possible in any serious examination of the case, a story that professional researchers, journalists, and the RCMP itself have, for decades, treated with a level of skepticism bordering on outright rejection, and understanding why requires looking closely at where the story actually came from, rather than only at what it claims. The account traces back most directly to a November 1930 newspaper article written by journalist Emmett E. Kelleher, who reported having spoken with LaBelle and published an account of the disappearance that, notably, differs in significant ways from the version that has become popular in the decades since. Kelleher's original reporting described a considerably smaller number of missing people and lacked several of the most dramatic details, including the opened graves and the sled dogs found dead, that later tellings would add. The story gained wider national attention the following year through a 1959 book by Canadian writer Frank Edwards, whose retelling substantially embellished the original account, adding many of the details that have since become inseparable from the legend, a pattern of escalating embellishment across successive retellings that mystery researchers recognize as one of the clearest warning signs of a story drifting further from its factual origins with each new version told. Critically, when researchers in later decades attempted to locate any official RCMP record corroborating the large-scale search operation the story describes, none was found. The RCMP itself has, on more than one occasion when directly asked about the case, stated that no record of an investigation into a missing Inuit village at Angikuni Lake matching the story's details exists in its archives, and that the scale of disappearance described in the most popular versions of the story, an entire community of 2 to 3 dozen people vanishing without a trace, investigated by both federal police and Army units, appears nowhere in any documented Canadian government record from the period. Some researchers examining the case's origins have also raised a further, more fundamental problem. No Inuit oral history or community record from the Kavalik region, an area whose communities have long maintained detailed, carefully preserved oral traditions about their own history, appears to corroborate an event of this magnitude occurring in their own recent past. A silence that would be genuinely extraordinary if a tragedy of this scale, the disappearance of an entire settlement's worth of people, had actually occurred within a community whose oral tradition has proven, in countless other instances, to reliably preserve far smaller and less dramatic events across generations. Taken together, this body of evidence, or rather the striking absence of it, has led the majority of serious researchers who have examined the Angikuni Lake case to conclude that the story, in the elaborate form it circulates in today, is most likely a piece of embellished or substantially fabricated journalism, built outward from what may have been a real, but far more mundane, encounter Joe LaBelle genuinely had. Perhaps a small, temporarily abandoned camp, of the kind Inuit families across the Arctic routinely left behind as part of ordinary seasonal migration patterns, encountered by a trapper unfamiliar enough with the specific rhythms of the community's movements to misinterpret an entirely normal absence as something far more sinister, a misreading, then seized upon and dramatically expanded first by a journalist working with limited fact-checking resources in 1930, and later by a popular writer with a documented pattern of embellishing already strange stories for a book aimed at a general audience hungry for the inexplicable. This is, without question, the most evidentially grounded explanation available for the Angikuni Lake story as it exists today. It is also, in its own way, one of the more unusual entries in this collection, precisely because the mystery it presents may not be a mystery of what happened to a vanished village at all, but rather a mystery of how a story with such thin original sourcing managed to become one of the most persistently repeated, unexplained disappearances in North American popular history, cited in books, documentaries, and articles for nearly a century, almost entirely detached from the increasingly obvious problems with its own foundation. And yet, even acknowledging this, even setting aside the most elaborate and least verifiable versions of the tale, the case has never been dismissed entirely by everyone who has examined it, for reasons that are worth taking seriously rather than waving away. Seasonal temporary abandonment of camps was indeed common practice across the Arctic, but researchers who favor a more cautious middle position point out that this same practice makes it difficult to rule out, with total confidence, that Joe LaBelle genuinely did encounter something unusual. Not necessarily the full dramatic disappearance later writers described, but perhaps a smaller, localized tragedy, an illness outbreak, a hunting accident, or an environmental hazard that claimed a small number of lives or forced a sudden, unplanned departure from a specific camp, an event modest enough to have gone unrecorded in official government files of the era, particularly given how sparse and inconsistent federal record-keeping in remote Arctic regions genuinely was during the 1930s, a period when the Canadian government's presence and administrative reach across the far north remained minimal at best. Under this more measured reading, the core of LaBelle's original account, an encounter with an unexpectedly, and perhaps troublingly, empty camp, may reflect something real, even if the most dramatic embellishments layered onto it by later writers, the opened graves, the extensive federal search, the strange lights, do not. This position doesn't require believing in anything inexplicable so much as acknowledging that the historical record from this period and region is thin enough, in general, that neither full confirmation nor full dismissal of even a modest version of LaBelle's story can be established with real confidence one way or the other. Beyond this cautious middle ground sit the theories that take the more elaborate, popularized version of the story at closer to face value. And it's here that the case's most persistent speculative threads emerge. Some researchers taking seriously the detail of unusual lights reported in the region's skies around the same period, a detail with at least some basis in genuine, if separate, historical reports of unexplained aerial phenomena over Canada's north during this era, have proposed a connection between the village's disappearance and some form of unexplained event tied to those sightings, without ever specifying a clear mechanism connecting the two beyond their rough geographic and temporal proximity. This remains, by any conventional evidentiary standard, among the most speculative explanations attached to any case in this collection, resting more on the evocative power of two strange details occurring in the same general place and time than on any documented connection between them. Others have proposed theories rooted in the region's own deep cultural history, drawing on genuine Inuit oral traditions describing entities associated with the tundra and long Arctic winters, figures existing within a rich, authentic body of pre-contact spiritual belief, as a possible framework through which to understand what might have happened at Angikuni, should something genuinely unexplained have occurred there. It's worth being direct about an important distinction here. These are real, long-standing cultural traditions belonging to Inuit communities, and invoking them as an explanation for a story whose journalistic origins are themselves questionable risks doing a disservice to traditions that exist independently of, and considerably predate, this specific piece of 1930s sensational journalism. Most researchers who have engaged seriously and respectfully with this angle treat it less as a literal explanation and more as an acknowledgement that any honest examination of the region's history has to reckon with belief systems considerably older and more internally coherent than the version of the Angikuni story constructed for a 1959 popular paperback. What the case leaves behind, when all of this is weighed together, is something genuinely unusual within this collection. Not a mystery built on an excess of unexplained physical evidence, but one built almost entirely on the opposite problem, a near-total absence of verifiable evidence, wrapped around a story specific and vivid enough that it has continued to circulate, essentially unchanged in its most dramatic form, for nearly a century, resistant to the very debunking that has, by any conventional standard, substantially undermined its most sensational details. Joe LaBelle himself left little further trace in the historical record beyond his initial brief connection to Kelleher's 1930 reporting. No substantial follow-up interviews, no additional testimony beyond what was captured in those early accounts, nothing further to clarify or expand on what, precisely, he claims to have witnessed on the shore of a remote lake in Canada's far north. Whether he encountered a genuine tragedy, an ordinary seasonal absence he misread through the lens of his own unfamiliarity with the region's Inuit communities, or embellished an unremarkable finding himself before it reached Kelleher's notebook, remains at this distance, essentially unrecoverable. What then is a researcher meant to do with a mystery thoroughly undermined by its own sourcing, and yet still, somehow, this durable? Is the true story of Angikuni Lake the one LaBelle originally told, the one Kelleher printed, the one Frank Edwards dramatically expanded for a paperback audience decades later? Or is the real mystery not what happened at that lake in 1930 at all, but the far stranger question of why a story with so little to stand on has managed to stand, in the popular imagination, for this long regardless?